Good morning, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us. The superintendent requested a few extra minutes, but welcome to the Darien Board of Education. This is a special meeting of the Policy Committee, Friday, September 16th at 8:30 a.m. We will be going through our regular policy review, which has been ongoing all summer. Thank you to everyone who has been working on it. We'll start with the proposed board policies recommended to repeal Series 6, some policies within the Series 6000. As you go through this, the guiding principles been if a state statute exists that governs these policies, what we don't want to do is have policies that are mismatched or old or outdated. So state policy kind of will trump ours anyway. So we will go through them, and we will entertain questions. I will say Ms. Sion and I have talked with our attorneys on these, so I think we're in a good spot, and I think it's just part of regular review. Mrs. Sion, we'll begin with policy 6110, school year calendar.
Recommendation from Shipman and Goodwin is to repeal this policy. We understand that the practice of the board is to propose a policy at one meeting and adopt it at the next, but having a written policy really hamstrings you in the event there's an emergency where you can't do that. So that's the recommendation is to repeal this policy. The requirements of a school calendar are all statutory.
Okay. Any questions on school calendar?
No, but just to clarify, you mean to propose a calendar at one meeting and approve it at the next?
Yes, sorry, I don't know what I said.
Just so we're clear. Thank you.
Okay, yep.
So right now, the board has a very kind of rigid policy on school calendars. School calendars are governed by state statute. This would allow us a little bit more flexibility in approving or making changes in between meetings, but it would still follow state statute. So the recommendation is to repeal. And if anyone sits through our late night meeting and gets to the end and says, let's look at the calendar review, and we all say yes, and then we move forward, they can understand why we might want to repeal this one. Policy 6210, and what we were getting into here are some curriculum policies. So just some language that we want to be really clear about. And Mrs. Sion, I'll just ask that we remain consistent in our language through all of these policies, is that we have the Board of Ed, we have the Board of Ed Curriculum Committee, we also have the District Leadership Curriculum, which is made up of the educators who actually write curriculum. The board approves curriculum. So I just want to make sure it's all laid out in the memo that people understand the difference between the two groups. And if we make sure the language is consistent through policy, we can best make sure everyone is aware of where we are playing. But we'll start with policy 6210.
Well, this is another one where Shipman and Goodwin's recommendation was to repeal the policy. But in talking to Dr. Adley and Dr. Tranberg, we understand that the Board of Education has a significant interest in having a role in this. And so I did check with Jessica Smith, and there is no problem with maintaining this policy.
Okay, any questions on 6210? Okay, so our recommendation to the board will be to maintain. Policy 6220, curriculum guides and course outlines.
Again, the recommendation is to repeal because the curriculum leadership team in the district is already doing this work of monitoring things, and that's really where the work belongs.
Okay, and we also heard a lot at the curriculum committee meeting about our new what's the software again? EduPlanet, thank you. Software, which will, have much of our curriculum updates. I think Dr. Tranberg ran through where to find curriculum on the board. So this is a little outdated, and this was how things were done in 2009, and we've significantly updated our practices. Policy 6230, program assessment.
Again, the recommendation is to repeal the policy because the district curriculum leadership team will assess programs on an ongoing basis, and that committee will report to the Board of Education Curriculum Committee, and that committee will decide the best way to present the review to the full boards. Not everything requires a presentation. Some things a memo will be sufficient.
Okay, any questions on 6230? Policy 6310, teaching about religion.
Right, so again, to repeal this policy, that's the recommendation. The legal principles are the legal principles, and especially the language that Jessica Smith found problematic was where such instruction has pedagogical relevance. That's going to be difficult for any teacher to understand what that means, and it has the potential to, to confuse, and it lacks a due process element for a teacher who might run afoul of this policy.
I will say, for me, I even looked at pedagogical relevance a little different, as that's a really such a subjective term that I was much more comfortable with the state language that recognized the need and respect for religion within aspects of things and student learning, but pedagogical relevance felt awfully subjective to me.
Yep.
Any other questions on 6310? Policy 6320, health education.
So the recommendation is to repeal this policy. There is a statute which goes into some detail about what is required in health education. Ours doesn't track the statute because it talks about things like community and consumer health and physical, mental, and emotional health. So the statute is more specific and gives better guidance to the district.
Any questions on 6320? Policy 6330, family life education and instruction on AIDS.
So family life education is not required. So to have a policy that talks about it when many of those topics are subsumed in health education is just confusing. AIDS education is required, so we don't need the statute for this. So instead, Shipman and Goodwin has recommended that we adopt a policy which sets forth the specific curriculum exemption areas that for families. So the recommendation is to repeal this policy.
Any questions on this? Now, with that, we currently have an exemption process, at least with surrounding AIDS education. And I'm assuming the model policy would take that into account.
Yes,
And does.
and adds
Okay.
the other applicable areas.
Any other questions? Okay, new policy 6330, curricular exemptions, which is next.
Right, right.
I knew I read it somewhere.
Right. So that sets out the 5 areas where families can exempt. It gives you a process and even a form to fill out.
Questions?
So my question on 6330 is if it's accurately reflecting state statutes, is it redundant? Do we need it?
So Shipman and Goodwin's advice is that it provides notice, specific notice to parents about what is they can opt out of.
Okay.
So they're not totally consistent. Julie, that's,
Yeah. Although sometimes if people are going to look for something
Yes.
that specific,
And that
it's
is-
better than, might be better than going, say, go list
That's
through all
the
the
reason.
statutes
Yep.
on something that important to a parent.
Tara, I have a quick question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Parent.
So it says in here that parents need to notify within the first 2 weeks of school. I'm just conjecturing, what would happen if there was a family that learns that their child is supposed to do a dissection and they learn that in January? What happens? Can they still exempt or no?
I think we would work in, as parent, I think we'd work in those situations on an individual basis as we do now for people who perhaps cannot, don't, or otherwise comply with a regulation around another topic. It would be similar.
so we'll check with Shipman and Goodwin to see whether we should revise that language. They are actually working on a slight revision to this policy anyway, but we felt it was critical to bring it forward now and revise it if necessary.
Yeah, and picking up on Mrs. Parent's question, sometimes, I mean, I think the start of school is to not disrupt the continuity of the school year, but sometimes these things happen in quarter classes or elective, sorry, not electives, that's a bad choice because then you don't have to choose to take it. But, if there are semester classes or quarter classes, then maybe we could just brush up the language there. That's not the start of school, but the beginning of the course
Yeah.
to provide flexibility for parents. Policy 6340, career and vocational education.
Again, the recommendation is to repeal. This is covered by statute, and language about the career and vocational education courses strengthening relationships between the community, school, and world of work is probably difficult to enforce and difficult to navigate.
I would just say, while I love the spirit of this policy, it's not really a policy to me, more of like a mission and a
Right,
belief.
correct.
And so seeing that come through in the vision of the graduate and creating pathways for students is a better place than a policy. So I don't want anyone to misunderstand that we don't think that this is an exceptional mission and something that, as far as I've seen up until this point, the board supports, but it's just not an enforceable policy. Policy 6350, programs for exceptional children.
So the recommendation again is to repeal. The state has adopted guidelines for districts about the identification of exceptional students, which we would cover in a new policy 6350. There is language that we added to that policy that talks about implementing a program, which again is not necessary. The law is that you need to identify exceptional students. You don't need to provide a program, but we carried the language over from this policy into the new policy. In addition, the Shipman and Goodwin feel strongly, as do Mrs. Klein and Dr. Tramberg, that singling out disabled children for programs is unnecessary since we are committed to the law and we follow the law in every aspect.
Could I just make one comment on the model policy
Mhm.
that we have? If in the second paragraph, if we could strike the adjective before programs, I just think we run into trouble. I'm on six, did I move six? Yeah, 6350,
The new one,
the new one. The language you added,
the superintendent shall develop,
programs. If it could just read programs.
Yep.
Thank you.
much better, thank you.
New policy, what, we just did that one, sorry. That's the new policy,
Yes.
6350, the model
I
policy.
think I had a question there. Are we saying that moving forward, any child being considered for as gifted, excuse me, as exceptional will go through the PPT process?
We're currently doing that. That's a requirement, yes.
Okay, for exceptional, not gifted in talent.
Not gifted talent.
I'm sorry,
twice
that's
exceptional.
that's what I was mixing up. Thank you.
Yep.
My bad.
So we have the model policy behind it. Are there any questions on 6350? Okay, policy 6360, homebound instruction.
Right, the recommendation is to repeal. This is covered by statute.
Anyone, any questions on that? Policy 6370, summer school.
So there's no requirement to run a summer school. The board considers summer school during the budgetary process, so there really, this policy is unnecessary.
This is one that I could support repealing. I can imagine at the board level, there may be some questions because I think we want to make sure we're not indicating that we're getting rid of summer school in any way, but there's no, this is really a local policy. And so we really have to understand whether we need this policy or we don't. I would support repealing it, but I just would highlight it for the board that this was really a local policy and they need to be aware of the change.
It also starts out with, that the board may establish something.
Yeah, May is interesting language in policies. Any questions? Policy 6410, student organizations.
Right, so the recommendation is to repeal. Again, the board votes every year on stipends for student organization. And I was just on the phone this morning monitoring, the use of the stipends and which clubs have sufficient enrollment. So the district administration does that throughout the year.
Any questions on 6410? Policy 6420, student publications.
Again, this is a stipended position, so there's no need for this policy. Jessica Smith also noted that the language shall provide as much opportunity as possible for the sincere expression of student opinion is pretty problematic and subjective. So she's recommending repeal.
Again, highlighting for anyone watching, we're not looking at ending any student publications. What this is a policy review of what policies are necessary in the district, and student publications as a policy where the recommendation is not necessary. Intramural programs. Policy
Again.
6430.
The board during the budget process adopts compensation for people who run the intramural programs. So that's where you would show your support of this. Also, the language in this about providing benefits to as large a number of students as possible, that they're carried on with the best interests of the participants as the first consideration. It's just, again, it's potential for subjective interpretation.
Questions on 6430? And arguably, well, it's an interesting policy that we currently have. I will leave it at that. So the board will have to take a look at that. Policy 6440, interscholastic programs.
The same thing here. It's a large portion of the budget and the board reviews it carefully during each budgetary process. Also, the language in the first paragraph about students being allowed to participate in individual sports on the basis of their physical condition probably runs afoul to the law, so it should be eliminated.
Any questions? So my one question kind of on this group is, I do know that we do need to provide some extracurricular activities. And so I'm assuming state statute will still govern the need to provide those.
Yeah, we'll always honor the state statute minimally, of course.
Yeah. Well, I don't want anyone to just be like, oh my gosh, they're cutting extracurriculars,
No,
we're not cutting
no,
anything.
we're not.
It's just that state statute provides for schools to provide some extracurricular, and I don't mean some particular programs, just some opportunities for children extracurricularly. And that, my understanding is that holds over a local policy. But if we could, I could be wrong,
Clarification.
but I'm pretty sure last time I checked that
We'll get
exists.
clarification, absolutely.
Any questions on that? Okay, policy 6450, continuing education programs.
So there is a legal requirement to provide high school equivalency, English language learner, citizen preparation, and adult ed, which we do that, so it makes the policy unnecessary.
Questions? Policy 60. I have something out of order here, sorry. 6510, I just have one out of order. We'll do 6510. I don't have it in front of me. Class size. Mrs. Sion.
Right, so Shipman and Goodwin's recommendation was to repeal the policy, but I did speak at length with Jessica Smith and Tara, and this is an important policy for the administration, every year. The administrator's recommendation is that the ranges are confusing to people, and they are on an ongoing basis, and so you can see that we eliminated the chart and just made the range 18 to 22. That's the administrative recommendation.
So the discussion that, and certainly defer to this group and also the board, full board, but the optimal range is confusion to the public and the general interpretation and use of it. So we can continue to have a discussion about what is the use of that, but we've basically delineated the lower limit and the higher limit, and to go with that. So that's kind of, we use the median projections for enrollment projections, and then we use the high projections for the budget development, and that's always been the consistent approach. And the optimal range just gets confusion in language because it's only reiterating what's between the lower range and the higher range. But I know it's going to have a discussion around it. I'll be happy to engage in that.
Yeah, as someone who worked on that grid, I like my grid.
I like your numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I like the numbers too. So the intent, and I think this will be a broader board conversation, but the intent was, and my understanding is prior we had something like is being suggested. And what we were trying to say is where we have room or where we really understand what we would like to do in the best case scenario, that the grid was valuable. I do think sometimes it then makes it hard for people in the public, like, well, why won't we be doing optimal? Optimal must mean best. I think there's something to that, although I recognize the problems with it. to me, I see big swings between 19 and 23 in a classroom. And there are educators who might know better or might disagree, but so I don't love the ranges because I feel like a lot of work went into the grid, but I would be open to board discussion because things evolve.
Right. I will miss the word optimal if it goes away. I'd be lying to say otherwise. That said, and I'm not suggesting this as policy language, but I understand that perhaps it's more of a sweet spot, and that might be a moving target depending on the composition of kids, the physical space, the age of the kids, et cetera. So I understand that it's not always that middle number that is the absolute right answer. But I agree with Mrs. Ackman. I think, 19 to 23 is a big swing when you're talking about 5-year-olds. So I think we need to have a little more discussion on this one problem.
I think that while I will miss optimal, I actually think that getting rid of optimal makes sense because there are classes currently that are not operating at optimal. And so therefore, are we saying as a district, well, we are not optimally providing the best education? I think providing a range is better. 23 kids versus 19 kids in a second grade classroom is a difference. Is it a huge difference? I don't believe it is. I think depending on the teacher, the cohort, you can be just as effective with 23 as you can with 19. I do think it makes it cleaner for the public to understand where we fall in terms of class sizes. I think the word optimal is suggests that that's the best, and when we don't get that, that's challenging.
So I guess the question is really, do we need a grid or do we need a range, right? And you could wordsmith it however you want. You could do mid, max, medium, right? Like we want, which I hear you is in the middle, but
I would suggest you go with well, the recommendation here, if we're going to change it at all, is just to change it to the range. That's all.
I think it makes it cleaner personally to just do the range that Shipman and Goodman suggested.
Well, no, Shipman and Goodwin suggested we repeal
Oh,
this.
sorry, the one that's in the model policy, the new policy.
Yeah, I would say this, I don't think we should repeal this policy, right? Generally, like I said, I like things to start locally, but I think we've worked very hard on this. I do think class sizes are really a local, there's a local consensus around and a funding mechanism around that should be respected as we go through the budget in what we're trying to achieve. I think this will engender some conversation. Let's put it that way. We should have a good conversation about it. We should understand where we want to go with it. But these are some pretty large swings for me. And so I think also would be for parents if they say that all of a sudden we're doing this. I also think.
But correct me if I'm wrong, Tara, the numbers are not different.
No, but I think this range could feel like it. I think what we used to do in the others, we had an understanding that like if the money existed in the budget and we could break classes out that small because we thought that was the ideal situation, we would. And now what we're saying is like we have a range and we can make that decision for a variety of reasons. Range, I think, allows more flexibility in the why we're making the class size that versus I think the intent of the grid was what's best for students. Now maybe it's just not being read that way or needs to be changed. So I don't feel definitively on this one way or the other, but I think this needs to be a really full board discussion.
Oh, just to be clear, and I think but to be clear, their administration is not recommending Shipman and Goodwin's recommendation to repeal it.
Neither are we.
Right, yes.
This is what I'm hearing. I mean, unless someone at the board table is different, I think the curriculum committee the policy committee is not recommending repeal.
Correct.
Right. And can I also say, I think, is it fair to say that the administration is also saying that this range is what is believed to be best for kids rather than specifically the middle number within these ranges?
We'll always make the decision in the best interest of kids, but yes, this is cleaner. I think it's they're not mutually exclusive concepts that we would always want to make it as small as we can within the range that we have. We would always do that.
I don't know if we always do that, but
We would always try to do that.
it sounds like this one will engender some conversation, which is probably a good thing because it's a local policy and we should really have a full discussion around it. I can't, yeah, I will. 6520, independent study.
The recommendation is to repeal that the Curriculum Leadership Committee in the district will monitor independent study where it's applicable and needed.
Questions? 6610,
So the recommendation here is to revise the policy. After speaking with Dr. Tramberg at the, he felt that at the board's curriculum committee meeting, that committee delegated to the, it's very confusing, to the district curriculum leadership committee, the selection and adoption of instructional materials.
so I think that's been clear and that's really how the district has operated, but I do think the language in this policy, if we could explicitly make it match the language in the other policies in the memo so that it's not confusing, that somehow the Board of Education Curriculum Committee is doing this, they just don't have the authority to. So if we can make the language match in that the board has delegated the educators to go and source things, but the board still approves curriculum, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, for me, it's that second paragraph, the last sentence, that the designated curriculum committee. Can we clean that up and say the district curriculum leadership committee or whatever that, the.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the way it is in the other policies and in the memo, so just if we match language, that would be great. Any other questions? Policy 6620, instructional materials,
And
copyrighted materials.
So the policy almost accurately reflects legal requirements, but it's burdensome and unnecessary since it is the law. Shipman and Goodwin will review the regulations to make sure that those comply with law and provide some clear guidance to teachers and other staff. And we will make sure that staff knows about the regulations so that they can comply.
Any questions?
Do we have a copyright compliance officer? That was a new term for me. Okay.
Do we
need
does
one?
the district leadership committee, through the assistant superintendent, check all copyrights, therefore is performing that function?
So we'll need to.
Yeah, well, the superintendent for curriculum development, the media spaces and so on are always overseeing and making sure that we're trying to be compliant or are compliant with copyright laws.
So hopefully we are always complying with copyright, and I would say that given that that's what Dr. Tramberg does, maybe we just make it explicit that that role is covered by the activities and responsibilities of the assistant superintendent of curriculum and instruction.
Right, so that.
And he
that
can
would be-
delegate as needed.
And that would be in the regulations because they're saying that we should repeal the policy, but just make the
Yes.
regulations clear.
Okay, any other committee questions? All right, we'll move to public comment. Mrs. McCammon, I saw your hand raised earlier.
I think on the class size policy, you need to look at the alternatives, because with the alternatives, you mentioned the optimal class size range, and given that we've removed that language from the grid, that's unclear about what you mean by optimal class size range, and it's not, I'm not sure that that's actually technically what they're using.
Right, yeah.
I think you're using just a balance to the best for the kids educationally. So I just would suggest that you take a look at the alternatives and see if they match the new one.
Any other public comment? Michelle, do you see any raised hands?
Would you like me to announce it?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. It's really.
For
quite
participants
the
in
morning.
Zoom, please click the raise hand option. There are no raised hands on Zoom in person.
All right, with that, can I entertain a motion to adjourn? Mrs. Best, Mrs. Parent, all in favor? It's all of us. Thank you, everyone.